Good evening, rich or poor, large or small, sooner or later you will come to my attention, or that of my fellow undertakers or funeral directors. And when we talk about the supernatural moves on along with technology, as our next tale will bring home. It was an early winter's evening, and at the hotel where the big sales conference was taking place, as the afternoon drew to a close, Tristram Jarvis was in mid-flow giving his presentation. He was very disconcerted to feel his mobile phone go off in his pocket. Although it was on vibrate, he hoped that nobody would have noticed, and he immediately had a fit of coughing to try and cover up any possibility that someone might have heard it go. At the end of the presentation, he was congratulated by the chairman, who also gave him a little bit of friendly advice. May I suggest, Tris, that next time you have your mobile phone on, you put it on vibrate or silent. Because you know I'm not very pleased on mobile phones going off in the middle of presentations. So Tristram had to accept he was in the wrong, waited for the chairman to go, and quickly looked at who had been phoning him. He saw it was his wife, and he tried phoning her back several times, but all the while he could either not get a signal or the line was permanently engaged. As the afternoon drew to a close, he joined his fellow delegates in the bar. The problem was they were all staying there the night, but there'd been a bit of a mix-up on the bookings, and Tristram had agreed that he would travel, as he only lived about 15 miles away from where they were. And as they sat there having a drink, suddenly his mobile phone went off, and everybody rude and what have you when they heard the sound of the Ride of the Valkyries coming through. Tris picked it up, answered it, and it was Liz, his wife. Tris, she said, it's snowing very heavily here. I suggest that you leave home for home fairly quickly. Tris thought that was a good idea, especially at that moment. Somebody came in from the car park into the bar, shutting the door behind him, but not before several flurries of snow had come in. So Tris finished his half pint of shandy, said goodbye to his colleagues, accepted their banter about having to go home, got in the car and made his way up over the wolds. He hadn't gone more than about a mile and a half out of the town, and he realised it was an absolute hopeless task. Snow was coming down thick. He was really having difficulty in getting a grip. So he thought the best thing he could do would be to go back to the hotel, and he would happily just spend the night on a chair in the bar rather than try and get home in this foul weather. But whilst he was thinking that, from out of a side road, a car shot out in front of him, lost complete control, rolled over and ended up in a ditch. For a moment, Tris was quite tempted to go ahead and leave them, but then he thought, well, if it's somebody who's hurt, I might be able to do something. And even as he got out of his car, he could see the car door open, the car was on its side, and he was totally unable to recognize what type of vehicle it was. The driver was a young woman, heavily wrapped up against the cold. She was quite upset, and Tristram said, well, look, there's no point us going anywhere. Come back to the village with me, and we'll see about what we can do getting you somewhere to spend the night. Actually, she said, my name is Carol Wakeford, and with my husband Terry, we run the Moorland Shepherd Hotel. It's only, about a mile and a half from here. We've nobody in at the moment. Why don't we go back there and you spend the night with us? Tristram was a little bit bemused. He'd never heard of a local hostelry called the Moorland Shepherd, but he decided it made more sense, and so some while later he drove into the car park of the Moorland Shepherd. As Carol had said, there was nobody else there, and so when they actually got into the hotel, she introduced him to her husband Terry, and right from the word go, Tristram was aware there was quite an atmosphere in the place. He declined a drink and was shown to his room, but even then he wasn't keen on spending the night there. Somehow the building was cold, it was unwelcoming, and to say that Terry's welcome left everything to be desired was not surprising. And so he sat in the room, tried getting out his phone to call Liz to say what had happened, but still couldn't get a signal. As he looked out of the window, he saw, in fact, that it had stopped snowing and had started to rain. So some 2 hours later, he quietly left the room, got out into the car park and drove away. He had thought about going to tell Carol and Terry, her husband, what had happened, but he could hear them having a massive argument in the back of the hotel and decided against it. The next day, when the sales conference drew to a close, Tristram realised he had left his mobile phone up at the Moorland Shepherd. He was in two minds whether to go back and collect it, but it had been an expensive model. It had just been given him for his birthday by Liz, and he really felt he ought to go and get it. He went back up to the Moorland Shepherd, but couldn't believe his eyes when he arrived. The sign had gone. The building was in absolute total, not so much in ruin, but it was absolutely derelict. All the windows had been boarded up. There was security fencing all round it, piles of weeds and overgrown plants all over the place. And he could not believe that this was where he had been less than 24 hours earlier. He found a way through the fence and went to where he knew his room had been only the previous night. But when he got there, the room was all boarded up, and obviously, nobody had been there for years. And whilst he's looking, undecided what to do, a voice from behind him said, "And would you mind telling us what you're doing here, sir, please?" He turned round and saw two police constables there. One was the older of the two, the other one tended to be much younger. "I know it sounds strange, officer," he said, "but I was actually here last night." "Oh, come on, sir," said the older one. "Couldn't possibly. You can see the state the building's in. Tell him, John." And so the younger constable took up the tale. He said, yes, it was 30 years ago. In fact, 30 years ago last night, when there was a murder here at the hotel. The owners, Carol and Terry Wakeford, had a very, very stormy relationship. And to be honest with you, nobody could understand why Carol had married the man. He was a bully. He undoubtedly knocked her around. And she had got to the stage that she was going to leave him. But the night she chose was the night, as I say, 30 years ago, when it snowed, just like it did last night. And she hadn't gone very far when her car went off the road. She said, and this is what we got from her husband later on, that a stranger had picked her up, brought her back to the hotel. But during the course of the night, Terry strangled her, and then he came along to murder the man she'd come home with, believing, in fact more than believing, suspecting that he was Carol's lover, only to find that the man had gone, totally vanished, and to this day nobody knows who he was. In fact, to the young constable, when my father was the detective superintendent here, he investigated the case. He used to come up here every night on the anniversary to see if the stranger came back, but he never did. And after the trial, nobody wanted the Cotswold Shepherd, the inn, and so it just fell into the state. You can see it now. But you say you were here last night? Yes, said Tristram, and I left my mobile phone in this particular room. And he pointed to the room involved. Well, there's a very easy way to settle this, isn't there, sir? Said the older constable. Give me your phone number and we'll ring it. And if we hear his ringtones, then you were here last night. What are his ringtones? It's the Ride of the Valkyries, said Tristram. The what? Said the young constable. But his older colleague smiled and said, these youngsters, they don't know their classical music like we do. So what's the number? So the older constable dialed it, And for a few moments, there was nothing. But then, with an ever-increasing sound, came the unmistakable tones of a mobile phone, and the tune, the ringtone, was The Ride of the Valkyries. And it came from the room that was boarded up where nobody had been for many years, the same room that Tristram had spent the night before. That's the story as I was told. Believe it or not, that choice is yours. Good evening. Good evening. I am an undertaker, sometimes referred to as a funeral director. And it makes no difference what your status in life is. Sooner or later, you will come to the attention of me or my colleagues. Ghosts don't ask to become ghosts. And sometimes it's thought that a ghost is a restless spirit because nobody knows what has happened to its body. And that is the case with my next story. It's going back to the year 1945. It's very early in May, and the location is somewhere in the North African desert. It's quite an important time of year. The Allies are in Berlin, and the end of the Second World War is literally only 2 or 3 days away. But for the RAF station based out there, it is still business as usual. I say based out there, I mean out there in the North African desert. The pilots really do not have very much to do, but there's still a war on, and they are still obliged to go out and fly on various patrols. The 3 pilots of Blue Flight have just been for their briefing. And as they sat there listening to the briefing officer, who always ends up with the words, "Take care, remember there's still a war on," the 3 of them mouthed his, "Take care, there's still a war on." As if, said Pete Evans when they left, as if we see any action here. "Doesn't matter," said Dougie. He was the leader of Blue Flight. He said, "We've still got a job to do." The problem was with these 3 young pilots, they had come into the war at a very, very late stage for various reasons. And they had done very little flying, let alone seen any action. The war was coming to an end, and they were conscious of their colleagues, their fellow flyers, who were sporting numerous medals across their breasts, and they had absolutely nothing. So Blue Flight took off under Dougie's leadership. They flew up into the sky, and having flown around, checked all their instruments and checked their weapons, they went off on their flight. Over the weeks and days they'd been doing it, they'd become rather blasé. They knew there were no enemy aircraft had been sighted in the area for months. Pete Evans was a little bit more wary. The reason being that his older brother had been a squadron leader and always insisted that no matter how boring the flight might be, take care, keep your wits about you. His brother had been shot down, and the last they heard, he was a prisoner of war somewhere in Germany. But with the advance of the Allies, nobody knew where he was, and they could only wait and pray. As the flight flew on, suddenly Pete is looking around himself, and he cried out, blue leader, bandits at 5 o'clock. This took everybody by surprise. Down in the communications room, the staff there had just been to brew some tea. But when this call came of bandits, did this really mean there was enemy aircraft around? The tea was forgotten, and the staff down there became professional again and took up their role. Go ahead, blue leader, what type of craft can you see? It's very strange, said Dougie, but you won't believe this, but they are 2 German triplanes. Triplanes? Came the comment from the communications. Triplanes? We haven't seen triplanes in this war. They went out during the last war. Well, I'm telling you, that's what I can see. They've got open cockpits. They don't have swastikas on the wings. but they have crosses. They are German aircraft. Going into the attack, cried the Brew leader, cutting off their communications, and all three of the English pilots flew at these two triplanes. I've got it, I've hit it, cried Rory, the third pilot. But my bullets just seem to be going straight through it. It's as if we're not here, or they're not here. And the other two pilots were saying the same thing. They were shooting at these two planes, shooting at the undefended pilots. And by rights, the planes should have been shot down. By now, the duty officer in the communications room is thinking it's a bit of a wind-up. So he sent for the commanding officer to come in and listen. Suddenly Pete cried, "Bandit at 9 o'clock. Oh no, he said, it isn't, it's one of ours. And this time another plane came in. But it was also an old-fashioned, old-looking plane. And this plane began to engage with the two other triplanes. But again, now it seemed as if the English plane's bullets were taking effect, because the first pilot of the triplane suddenly slumped over and his plane went spiralling downwards into the desert below. At the same time, the other triplane shot back, and this time it was the British pilot who slumped forward. His plane, now out of control, crashed into the other triplane, and both craft fell to the desert. This is the commanding officer calling. Blue flight, all three of you return to base immediately. This message timed at 10:43 hours. They went back to base, were summoned in to see the commanding officer, who was absolutely furious. He said, "How can you say these are triplanes? We haven't seen any of them for years." "I'm telling you," said Rory, "the two of them were triplanes. I know because my father was in the Royal Flying Corps and he used to drill aircraft silhouettes, makes, patterns and pictures into us when we were small. They were definitely triplanes. And the British plane, that was an old Bristol. And I'm absolutely positive for the same reason." "Don't talk rubbish," snapped the commanding officer. "There is no other British flight base anywhere near here. And there's no German activity, and as far as we know, there was never any triplanes flying in this area during the First World War. As far as I'm concerned, you're either drunk or something, and the three of you are now grounded indefinitely. Goodbye." The three pilots went out quite dejectedly and suffered all the various banter, mickey-taking and abuse that came from their colleagues. "Oh, been shooting the Red Baron down, have we? Oh, having a bit of fun, the flying circus and all the rest," which they tried to put up with, but they were adamant they could not be shaken from their story, that this is what they had seen. They had witnessed, become part of, for some reason or other, a dogfight that had happened there during the First World War. They never flew again, and as soon as possible they were demobbed. And you can imagine their surprise some 5 years later when they received a handwritten invitation from the commanding officer. Would they attend a reunion? They didn't really want to go, but the CO had written to them personally and said, "I really do want you to come to this event." Against their better judgment, they decided they would go. So you can imagine when they arrived, the sort of banter and, well, it was more than just mickey taking, it was quite offensive, some of the attitude there from these other pilots, who all they believed that they'd come up with this story to get themselves grounded on medical reasons so they didn't have to fly again during the war. After a bit, the commanding officer said, Gentlemen, please, your attention, I have a very important announcement to make." And he indicated the three pilots from Blue Flight and said, "Gentlemen, when I grounded you, I accused you of all manner of nefarious deeds. I owe you a very, very sincere apology." Now you could hear a pin drop in the room. "Believe it or not," he said, "I did have the location checked out, where you said the 3 planes had crash landed, and they were checked out. Not for a while, I hasten to add, but they were in one of these parts of the desert that hadn't been changed, hadn't been touched for years. And in this part of the desert were found the wreckage of 3 planes. 2 German triplanes and a Bristol M1C British flight. For some unknown reason, they hadn't been touched, hadn't been scavenged much at all. But the interesting thing was that the British pilot had a watch on him, still there, and the watch had stopped at 10:43 hours. As you remember, 10:43 hours, that was the time you had reported the planes crashing and my summoning you back to base. So, it may take ghosts and spirits a long time to finally find rest, but it does happen. Or so I have been told. Perhaps one of these days I shall find out. Thank you.